So, one of the things that you're on record as saying is that, fermentation is an emotional roller coaster, right? And, you've got the wine background, so fermentation extremely well, very intimately. And what that made me think of when I read that as I was preparing for this interview is that I don't recall, and I listen to multiple agave specific podcasts. I have some good ones in my Rolodex that I listen to on a weekly, bi-weekly basis. And I like to think that I have some friends who know a lot more than I do about agave. And one of the things that I've never heard once in listening to these podcasts and talking to these people is that mezcaleros down in Mexico are even really phased by the fermentation process. So that got me thinking, what are some of the differences as somebody who has Mexican heritage, who is making a Mexican product here in the United States? What are some of the differences that you see? I mean, feel free to talk about fermentation and why it's an emotional roller coaster, but also I'm curious to know if you can speak to that larger kind of like cultural translation question, because I think that's kind of at the heart of this project.
You bring up a lot of great points to talk about because what we're really dealing with is almost a comparison of like an old world and new world mentality that we go into making agave spirit. It was like the same thing when we talked about the new world and old world in wine. You asked old world wine producers, and I'm generalizing here, why do you do this? Why is it that you guys are doing this? Or why don't you do this? And most of the responses I ever got was, well, that's just the way we've been doing it for 100 years, 200 years, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I like that approach. I think there's some real it's authentic because they haven't gone off script there. And then you find the onesies and twosies in those regions that are you know moving the needle here with how they produce. And so it kind of goes back to like how we're doing it here in the United States. Like there's not a lot of information in the United States about agave fermentation. There isn't a lot of shared knowledge between us and Mexico, for a lot of reasons. They might want to keep their trade secrets to themselves. Maybe there's this kind of you know, like the process is so different that it wouldn't even make sense, which has been, done and done again here with how we've had to make agave spirit here. We don't have the equipment like they do in Mexico. Like you said, we don't have the $250,000 auto diffusers. Like we don't have, I'm sorry, the autoclaves and diffusers, and we don't even have ornos. Like we're literally building pits in people's farms and cooking agaves because that's the only method we have here. When we go to
Yeah.
shred agave, we don't have
And
those
then
really.
California sees smoke, right? And everyone's completely unconcerned.
Oh yeah, yeah. I won't even get into that one because it's always fun when you see a white plume of smoke and got to call the neighbors once in a while and go, "Hey, just so you know, we're going to be doing another cook, so don't call the cops on us." But yeah, so I think there's like a lot of stuff that we're learning here, and especially in American craft distilling. Like in my experience, everything comes out of a sack, out of a tote of syrup. Everything is already engineered to give you maximum efficiencies, maximum sugar, so you can get the most alcohol and the most bang for your buck. And with when you're dealing with a natural product, that isn't the case. Your sugars are going to vary based on your on your yearly temperature swings. If it was a wet year, a dry year, just like grapes are. And so there is that aspect that like we don't really deal with in craft distilling here. And then also a lot of our craft distilleries here are engineered for whiskey production, brandy production, gins, things that are very very mainstream here. Versus you go to Mexico, it's in tequila or mezcal, their process is strictly to make one thing, and that's their agave spirits. And so kind of going back to the Marine Corps thing, was something that we learned very well was adapting and overcoming. And so we've had to basically build our own practices here in California, and every producer that's doing it here does it in a similar way, but we're doing it differently. And so we've basically had to figure out, how do you cook the agave? How do you shred the agave? How are you fermenting the agave? And the reason it's such an emotional roller coaster for us is because we're trying to ferment something that ideally doesn't always have all the fermentable sugars that you want it to have. The inulin conversion can be so mystical, and the fermentation could be such a wild ride, because one day it's doing great and you're like, cool, this is going to be done in, a couple days. You come back the next day and it's flat. Like, what's going on here? Like, what are you doing? And so you really have to be in the moment and adapting to the fermentation. And then also, you stop taking the science out of it sometimes, and you just really kind of go with your gut, which I think the old world guys do that very well. And so I've been really trying to play both fields here. On one hand, I want to be very scientific and driven in a way that's all data points and note taking. And then on the other hand, it's, let it be, see what happens, and I think we obviously have so much to learn, and more repetitions to get under our belts. But the more we do it, the more we understand it, and the more we're honing in on our process and flavor profile.